There is a word people add to your name when they think they're being honest about you. They don't say it to wound. They say it the way you'd note the weather. This is Clara. She's adopted, you know. A little tag, fastened to the end of an introduction, and for a second, the room rearranges itself around you. You watch people do the small arithmetic. You feel yourself become a category before you finish being a person. I grew up wearing that word the way you wear a coat handed down from someone you never met. It fit, mostly. It kept the cold off. But I always knew it wasn't cut for me, and so did everyone who saw me in it. For 30 years, I let them add the word and I said nothing. I thought silence was the same as peace. I learned eventually that it isn't, that some people read your quiet as permission, and they keep taking until there's nothing left to take but the one thing they were sure had never belonged to you. My name is Clara Hale, and this is the story of the day a lawyer opened a folder, looked at a room full of people who'd already decided what I was worth, and read my name out loud. Hi, I'm Martin. Sit with me for a bit. Tonight we're going to spend some time with Clara, 36, a piano teacher, a woman who was handed a word at 6 years old and made to carry it the rest of her life. She walked into a room expecting to leave with nothing. What her grandfather had arranged was something none of them saw coming. If you're not subscribed, now's the time. We're here every day. Let's go. My grandfather made tea the same way every evening of his life, and I want to tell you about it before I tell you about anything else. Because if you understand the tea, you understand the man. And if you understand the man, you'll understand why none of what happened was an accident. He warmed the pot first, always. He'd fill it with hot water from the kettle, swirl it twice, and pour it out. A pot you were only going to fill again, warmed for tea you hadn't made yet. The first time I watched him do it, I was 6 years old, and I asked him why, and he said, because the tea deserves to land somewhere ready for it, Clara. You don't drop something fragile onto a cold surface. Then he set the pot down and looked at me for a moment longer than the question required, and I understand now, 30 years too late to thank him for it, that he wasn't only talking about tea. His name was Walter Hale. He was my grandfather, and he was the first home I ever had that didn't get taken away. I came to him sideways, the way some children come to the people who raise them. My mother, my real mother, my first mother, the one I have to reach back through a lot of years to find, was named Rose. She was Walter's younger daughter, and she died when I was 6, in the middle of a Tuesday, in the cereal aisle of a grocery store, from something in her brain that had been waiting her whole life and gave no warning when it finally came. An aneurysm, a word I learned the way children learn the words that break their lives in half. One morning I had a mother. At dinner I had a grandfather kneeling on a hospital floor with his hands over his face, and an aunt standing very straight beside him because someone had to, and a future that had quietly changed owners. The aunt was Margaret, Rose's older sister, Walter's other daughter. And when the dust settled and the adults had their terrible conversations in the kitchen with the door not quite closed, it was Margaret who said, "She'll come to us," not as a question, as a thing already decided, the way Walter decided things. She and her husband took me in. They adopted me, made it legal, made it permanent, made me their daughter on paper in a courthouse that smelled like floor wax and old coffee. I became Clara Castle for 18 years until I was old enough to quietly change it back. That's the part everyone always nods along to. The aunt who took in the orphan niece. It sounds like the warm beginning of a kind story. It was the beginning of a different one. Margaret's husband was named Gordon, and I need to be careful here because the easy thing would be to make Gordon a monster from the first sentence. And that isn't true, and the truth is worse. When I was 7 years old, Gordon Castle taught me to ride a bicycle. I remember it the way you remember the few good frames in a long gray film. It was a Saturday. The street was empty and gold at the end of the day, that light that only happens in late spring when the sun gives up slowly. He held the back of the seat and ran behind me, and I could hear him breathing, this big out-of-shape man jogging down the middle of the road with his hand on my bicycle, saying, "I've got you, I've got you. Keep pedaling, don't look back at me, look where you're going." And I did. I looked where I was going, and at some point, his hand wasn't there anymore, and I was riding, actually riding, the wind doing that thing to my ears, and I heard him behind me, far behind me now, shouting, not angry, the opposite of angry. "That's it. That's my girl. Look at you. That's my girl." He said it that day, and he meant it, and I held on to that sentence for years, the way you hold a coin you're saving, because it was the only time he ever said it. I want you to know he was capable of it. I want you to know there was a man in there who ran down a street for me once, because everything else I'm going to tell you, he chose. And a man who could run down a street for a 7-year-old and then become what Gordon became didn't fall into it. He walked. Gordon was a salesman, regional manager for a company that sold kitchen equipment to restaurants, ranges, walk-in coolers, the big industrial things. And he was good at it, in the way that certain men are good at making you feel, for the length of a handshake, like the most important person in the room. He had a laugh he could turn on. He remembered the names of people's children. He could walk into Margaret's family, into the Hales, who were quiet and exact and a little hard to impress, and within an hour have my grandfather chuckling at something. But here is the thing about a man whose whole gift is making you feel chosen. You eventually learn how cheap the feeling is, because he's giving it to everyone. He gave it to waitresses. He gave it to the women he met on the road, in the towns where his work took him, the ones Margaret didn't know about for years and then knew about and pretended not to. He gave it to anyone who could give him something back: admiration, money, the warm idea of himself he needed other people to keep alive. He gave it to my grandfather, too, right at the end, when it would pay. But I'm getting ahead of the tea. Let me tell you about the Green Book, because I need you to know it existed long before any of this, so you'll believe me about what was inside it. My grandfather kept a notebook, green cloth cover, the corners gone soft and pale from his hands. He kept it on the little table beside his reading chair, and most evenings, after the tea and before bed, he'd open it and write for a few minutes in his small, square engineer's handwriting. I asked him once, when I was maybe 9, what it was. I thought it might be a diary. It seemed like a private thing. He said, "It's where I keep what I notice." I asked what he meant. He thought about it the way he thought about everything, taking it seriously because I'd asked seriously. He said, "People show you who they are, Clara, mostly in small things, things they don't think anyone's watching. And it's easy to talk yourself out of what you saw later when it's inconvenient. So I write it down, so I don't have to argue with myself about what's true. I didn't understand it then. I thought it was just a thing old men did, like warming the pot. I didn't know that for years that Green Book had been quietly filling up with the small things Gordon showed when he thought no one was watching. The receipt for a hotel 2 states away on a week he told Margaret he was in the next county. The way he spoke to her in front of the family versus the way the family pretended not to hear him speak to her when the front door had just closed. The Christmas he gave my grandfather a bottle of expensive scotch, and then, in the same visit, asked Walter, casually between innings of a ball game, whether he'd thought about getting his affairs in order, just to make things easy on everyone. Walter wrote it all down, years of it, in his small square hand, so he wouldn't have to argue with himself later about what was true. I didn't know any of that. I only knew the Green Book existed, and that it lived by his chair, and that it was the most private thing in the house, and I never opened it. I'm telling you it existed now, so that you'll believe later that my grandfather was never fooled, not for 1 minute, not even at the end, when he let Gordon think he was. I want to slow down and tell you about the music, because the music is the part of him I still have, and because it's the only inheritance I ever asked for. Walter played the piano every evening of his life, not for an audience. There wasn't one. He played the way other men water a garden. After supper, after the tea, he'd sit at the old upright in the front room and play for half an hour while the light went out of the windows. Bach, mostly. Some Chopin when he was tired. A little Schubert when he was sad, though he'd never have said he was sad. I learned to read his whole week by what came out of that piano. He started teaching me when I was 7, the year I came to live nearby, the year of the bicycle, the year everything was raw. I think now that the lessons weren't really lessons. I think they were how he held a grieving child without either of us having to say the word grief. He'd sit me on the bench beside him and put my small hands on the keys and say, "This one is C. Everything starts from C. When you get lost, you come back to C." And I'd find it, and he'd nod, and for 30 minutes a day, there was a place in the world where I knew exactly what was expected of me and exactly how to do it, and nobody added a word to the end of my name. I got good, not prodigy good. He'd have hated that word. He distrusted prodigies. He said they confuse speed for depth. But I got good in the way he respected, which was slow and complete. By the time I was 16, I could play the pieces he loved, and we'd trade off, him then me, the two of us passing an evening back and forth across that keyboard, like a conversation that didn't need any other language. That's what I want you to see when you picture us. Not the inheritance, not the money, a man and a girl on a piano bench in the failing light, and the whole rest of the family somewhere else in the house, on the other side of a wall, in a different story entirely. I teach piano now. I have students, children mostly, and a few adults who always wanted to learn and finally let themselves. I'll teach in a community music school 3 days a week, and out of my apartment the other days. And the first thing I tell every new student on the first day before anything else is this: everything starts from C. When you get lost, you come back to C. They don't know they're getting a dead man's words. They don't need to. I should tell you about the two sisters, because you can't understand why my grandfather did what he did at the end without understanding what he'd already watched happen, once, slowly, to a daughter, and was not willing to watch happen again. Walter had 2 girls, Rose and Margaret. Their mother, my grandmother, a woman I never met, died young too, of a different thing, when the girls were teenagers. And so Walter raised them mostly alone. In the years he was also building Hale Tool and Instrument out of a rented garage into a real company with a real payroll. He used to say he raised 2 daughters and 1 business and got 2 of the 3 right. He'd say it as a joke. It wasn't entirely a joke. He was a careful man, and he knew the difference between the things he'd done well and the things he'd only done. Rose was the younger, the easy one, the one the light bent toward, the same way it would later bend toward no one, because Rose died before life could ask anything hard of her. I have her in fragments, a laugh, a yellow kitchen, her hand on the back of my neck in a grocery store, 2 minutes before everything ended. People who knew her tell me she was warm in a way that filled a room, and I believe it, because my grandfather, who measured his words like wire, called her the best of my children in a letter I'll get to, and Walter did not hand out a word like best. Margaret was the older one, and the older one always carries something the younger one never has to. Margaret was the responsible girl, the one who held things steady while her father built a company, the one who learned early that her job was to not need much. Does that sound familiar? It should. I learned the same lesson in the same house from the same kind of silence. Margaret raised herself a little, the way I raised myself a little, and a girl raised on not needing grows into a woman who'll accept astonishingly little and call it enough. So, when Gordon Castle came along, loud, certain, full of that warmth he could turn on like a tap, telling Margaret she was the most important person in the room, She didn't recognize it as a salesman's trick. She'd never been the most important person in any room in her life. She married him fast, against Walter's quiet, unspoken, never stated reservation, the kind of reservation a careful father swallows because his daughter is 30 and happy for the first time, and who is he to set a fact against a feeling? He swallowed it. He walked her down the aisle, and then he spent the next 30 years watching the tap run dry, an inch a year, and writing down what he saw in a small square hand, and never finding the door. That was the failure he caught too late, the first time. A daughter he couldn't reach through. He was an engineer. You only let a thing fail completely once. After that, you redesign. I didn't know any of this growing up. I only knew the surface. Two sisters, one dead, one married to Gordon, and me handed sideways from the first to the second. But the architecture was already old by the time I arrived. The dynamic in that house wasn't built for me. I just got slotted into a structure that had been standing and failing for decades before I was born. So that was the shape of my childhood, and you could draw a line right down the middle of it. On one side, my grandfather, the tea, the piano, the green book, the steadiness, a house where I was a whole person. On the other side, the house I actually lived in, Margaret and Gordon's house, where I was a kindness somebody had done. I don't say that to be cruel to Margaret. I want to be very clear about Margaret, because she is not the villain of this story, even though she let a lot of villainy happen in the room she was standing in. Margaret was drowning. I just didn't have the word for it as a child. I thought adults were the way they were because that was the way they decided to be. I didn't understand that a person can disappear an inch at a time, over 20 years, married to a man who teaches you every single day in 1,000 silent ways that you are not enough and never were, until one morning you look up and the woman who used to laugh has been gone so long you can't remember the sound. Margaret loved me. I believe that now. But she loved me the way a drowning person holds onto a child, half rescue, half hoping the child will somehow keep her afloat. She fed me, clothed me, sat in the audience at every recital, drove me to lessons, and she also taught me, without ever meaning to, that love in that house was something you earned by not being a problem, by being fine, by being the easy one. So I was so fine. I was the finest child anyone ever saw, and it cost me something I'm still adding up. Gordon's lesson was simpler, and he taught it on purpose. His lesson was, you are here on sufferance. He never let me forget the courthouse. Not in so many words. He was too smart for so many words. But in the spaces around the words. At dinner, if money was tight, his eyes would find me. When his own people came over, his brother Wesley, the cousins, that whole loud clan, he'd introduce me last and lightest. And this is Clara. A pause. Margaret's sister's girl. We took her in. We took her in, as though I were a stray that had wandered up the porch in the rain. The first time I heard the actual word weaponized, I was 11. I'd broken a glass, just an accident, the way children break glasses. And Gordon, who'd had a few, said to Margaret, not quietly, you know, your sister's kid is a lot of money for somebody who isn't even ours. Isn't even ours. Over a glass. I was 11, on my knees with a dustpan, and I learned in that second exactly what the ledger of that house looked like and which column I was in. I went to my grandfather's the next afternoon, and I didn't say anything about it because I'd already learned not to be a problem. But he looked at me over the warming pot, and he said, something happened. Not a question. He always knew. I shook my head, and he didn't push. He just said, see, and nodded at the piano. And we played until it was dark. I found out years later that he wrote that down too. He'd seen me come in. He wrote in his small square hand. She broke something at the house. Won't say what. 11 years old and already protecting them from me. Watch this. Watch this. Like a man marking a problem in a machine. He'd been an engineer his whole life. You catch the failure early, when it's small, when there's still time to design around it. He was already designing around it. I just didn't know yet that I was the part he was building the whole thing to protect. The years went the way years go. I left. The day after I turned 18, I changed my name back to Hale, quietly, at the same courthouse where they'd made me a castle. And I never asked anyone's permission, and nobody but Walter ever said a word about it. When I told him, he didn't smile exactly. He put his hand flat on the table for a second, like he was studying something. Then he said, "Good. That was always your name." That was all. But I drove home from his house that day with my whole chest loose, like I'd put down something I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped feeling the weight of it until it was gone. I went to school for music. I started teaching. I built the kind of small, plain, good life that nobody writes stories about. A life with a piano in it, and enough money and quiet evenings. I stayed close to Walter. I drifted from Margaret and Gordon's house the way you drift from a place that was never quite yours, with a guilt I could never fully justify or fully shake. And Gordon kept being Gordon, and Margaret kept disappearing, and somewhere in there my grandfather got old. That's the part I didn't see coming, even though it's the most predictable thing in the world. He got old. Walter Hale, who warmed the pot, who kept the green book, but taught a grieving child to find C, he got old. And then he got sick. And the getting sick was fast in the way that fools you, the way that makes you think there's more time than there is. His heart mostly, and then his lungs conspiring with the heart. By the last winter, he was tethered to an oxygen line in the front room, and Yvonne came 5 days a week. Yvonne is home health aide, a steady woman with a low voice, who I will be grateful to until the day I die. And the piano set closed, because he didn't have the breath for it anymore. That was the thing that told me more than any doctor did. The closed piano. A man who'd played every evening of his life, sitting 6 feet from a piano he couldn't open. I went every day I could. I'd sit with him, and we wouldn't talk much. Talking tired him. But I'd play for him. On the piano he couldn't use. The pieces we'd traded back and forth for 30 years. And he'd close his eyes, and his hand would move a little on the blanket. The fingers finding the notes in the air, playing along where I couldn't hear. And that was the closest thing to a goodbye either of us ever managed to say out loud. And it was that winter, the winter the piano stayed closed, that Gordon Castle discovered he loved his father-in-law. It would be almost funny if it weren't what it was. For 30 years, Gordon had treated Walter as an obstacle and an opportunity in roughly equal measure. A stiff old man to be charmed at holidays and otherwise endured. He'd never once visited him for no reason, never sat with him, never that I knew of had a single conversation with him that wasn't transactional. And then Walter got sick, and the will came into focus, and suddenly Gordon Castle was a devoted son. He started coming around. He'd show up at the house with things, a fancy blanket, a basket of fruit Walter couldn't eat, a bottle of the good scotch the doctors had forbidden. He'd settle into the chair beside the bed, the chair by the little table where the green book still sat, and he'd talk in this new soft voice I'd never heard him use, this bedside voice, and he'd say things like, "We're going to take such good care of you, Walter, and don't you worry about a thing, we'll handle everything, and family takes care of family. Family takes care of family." From the man who'd spent 30 years reminding me I wasn't quite it, I watched him do it. I'd come for my afternoon visit and find him already installed in the chair, performing his devotion, and I'd feel something cold move through me because I could see exactly what it was, and I couldn't say it, because what do you say? You can't accuse a man of being kind. That's the genius of it. That's the perfect cover. He'd built a fortress out of fruit baskets and soft voices, and from inside it, he could do anything. And the moment anyone objected, they'd be the one who looked monstrous, suspicious of a man being nice to a dying old soul. Shame on you. Here is the part I'm not proud of. There was an afternoon I came in, and Gordon was sitting in the chair, reading to my grandfather. Reading, actually reading to him, the newspaper, in that soft voice. And Walter's eyes were closed, and for 1 second I wanted to walk over and tip the man out of the chair onto the floor, just to see his face, just to break the performance for 1 second and see what was under it. I wanted it so badly my hands ached. That's not the calm, patient woman I've been describing. That's a real thing I felt, standing in the doorway of my dying grandfather's house, and I'm telling you, because it was true. I went and sat on the other side of the bed, and I waited, the way I always waited. And when Gordon finally left, patting Walter's hand, saying, "You rest now, we've got you," my grandfather opened his eyes. He looked at me, and then he did something I'll never forget. He looked over at the green book on the little table, and then back at me, and the corner of his mouth moved, just barely, the smallest, driest thing, and he said in his ruined whisper, "He thinks I can't hear him on the phone in the hall." That was all. He closed his eyes again, but I understood. Gordon out in the hall, between visits, making his calls, thinking the old man was too far gone to follow it, and my grandfather lying there with his eyes closed and his whole engineer's mind perfectly intact, listening, noticing, keeping what he noticed. He was never fooled, not for 1 minute. There's a person in this story I haven't given enough room to, and that's Mrs. Pruitt, the next-door neighbor, because the world is made of people like Mrs. Pruitt, and they see everything, and they're never asked. She'd lived beside Walter for 40 years. She brought soup that whole last winter, real soup, the kind you can actually eat, which made her the only person whose gifts to a dying man were of any use. And Mrs. Pruitt was not fooled by Gordon for a single second, and unlike me, she had no reason to keep quiet, so she didn't. I was leaving one evening, and she was at her mailbox, and she stopped me and she said, "That son-in-law, the big one with the laugh." I nodded. She said he didn't darken that door in 40 years. Now his car's here 3 times a week. She looked at me very levelly, an old woman who'd watched a lot of people be a lot of things. I knew a man once who got attentive right when his mother got sick. You know what we called it in my day? She said, "Inheritance flu. Comes on sudden. Clears up the day after the funeral." And she picked up her mail and went inside. Inheritance flu. I thought about that phrase for a long time. I think about it still. I tell you about Mrs. Pruitt because I want you to understand that this was not subtle, that a woman at a mailbox could diagnose it in 1 sentence. The only people who claimed not to see it were the people who needed not to. And the chief of those was Margaret, my mother, who that whole winter kept saying, with a kind of desperate brightness, "It's nice, isn't it, that Gordon's finally connecting with Dad. Connecting with Dad." She needed it to be real so badly, because if Gordon was capable of sitting with a dying old man out of love, then maybe, the 30 years had been something other than what they'd been. Maybe there was a good man in there after all, and she hadn't wasted her life. I watched her hold on to that idea like a railing, and I didn't take it from her. That was another thing I said nothing about. There are mercies that look like cowardice, and I've stopped trying to tell them apart. My grandfather died in March, just before dawn, with Yvonne holding one of his hands and me holding the other, and the window starting to go gray, and the piano closed across the room. I'm not going to dress it up. There's a moment when the breathing changes, and then there's a moment when it stops, and the space between those 2 moments is the longest thing I have ever lived through. And then it was over, and the room was very quiet, and Yvonne reached across and closed his eyes with 2 fingers, gently, the way you'd close a book you intended to read again. And she said, there now, Walter." And I sat there holding a hand that was already not quite his anymore, and I thought, with a clarity that frightened me, I have just become the last person on earth who knows me. Not grief yet, Grief came later, in waves, for months. In that first moment, it was just the bottom dropping out. He was the one home that never got taken away, and now it had been taken away, the same as all the others. And I was 36 years old and an orphan in the truest sense, for the second time in one life. I want to tell you about that morning, and not about what came after. Because what came after is the part you clicked on, and the morning is the part that was actually mine. I sat with him after Yvonne called the people you call. I went to the front room and I opened the piano. I hadn't touched it all winter. It had been his, closed, waiting. I opened it and I played the Bach, the one we always came back to. I played it badly, my hands shaking, the tears making the keys swim. And it didn't matter. It was the most important thing I have ever played, and I played it for a man who could no longer hear it, in a house that no longer had him in it. And that is the funeral I gave my grandfather, the real one, before the lawyers, before the family, just me and the open piano and the gray window. The other funeral, the official one, was 4 days later, and Gordon Castle gave a eulogy. He was magnificent. I'll give him that. He stood up in his good dark suit, and he talked about Walter as though they'd been the closest of friends, as though all those decades of contempt had been some other man, and he had the church dabbing its eyes. He talked about Walter's wisdom. He talked about those last precious months we spent together. He talked about everything this family meant to him. And I sat in the second pew, next to Margaret, who was weeping, real weeping, her whole body. And I held her hand, and I watched her husband sell a dead man back to a room full of mourners, and I said nothing. I was very good at saying nothing. I'd had 30 years of practice. But Mrs. Pruitt was in the back, in a navy coat, and when Gordon said those last precious months, I saw her face. And her face said inheritance flew, plain as a headline. And for 1 second, across that whole grieving church, an old neighbor and I looked at each other and understood each other completely. And it was the only honest thing that happened in that building all day. The day after the funeral, Gordon called me. The very day after. Mrs. Pruitt's timeline, to the hour. Clara, he said, in the soft voice, the bedside voice he hadn't retired yet. I know this is a hard time. I just think, for everybody's sake, we should sit down soon and start sorting out Walter's affairs. Get ahead of it. You know how these things can get complicated. Margaret's not up to it. She's a wreck, poor thing. So I told her I'd handle it. For the family. For the family. Start sorting out Walter's affairs. The man had been in the ground for 18 hours. I said I thought we should wait until after the reading of the will. There was a will. Everyone knew there was a will. Walter had used the same lawyer, Howard Greer, for 40 years, and Howard had already called to schedule the reading. There was nothing to sort out. There was a document, and it would say what it said. There was a pause on the line, and then Gordon sent something that I have kept, the way Walter kept things, so I wouldn't have to argue with myself later about what was true. He said, Sure, the reading, of course. And then lighter, almost a joke, almost. Although between you and me, Clara, you might want to manage your expectations a little. I know you and the old man were close, but Margaret was his daughter. You were the smallest hesitation, the tiniest knife, you know. His granddaughter, Rose's girl, the one we took in when there was nobody else to do it. Your family, in the ways that count, sweetheart. But when it comes to the legal stuff, the actual estate, that goes to the daughter. That's just how it works. I'd hate for you to get your hopes up. Manage your expectations. You know. I'd hate for you to get your hopes up. I said, I don't have any hopes, Gordon. And I hung up. And it was true. I didn't. I wasn't thinking about money at all. I'd have given every cent of whatever there was to have 10 more minutes on that bench. The idea that I was sitting at home plotting to seize my grandfather's estate, the idea that I needed to be talked down from my expectations, was so far from the truth that I almost laughed. But I want to be honest about something. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment, and I thought about the way he'd said your, you know, the little pause where the word adopted was supposed to go and didn't have to, because we both heard it anyway. 30 years of that pause, and I felt under the grief something else, something small and hot, and not very dignified. I wanted him to be wrong, not for the money, for the pause. I wanted just once for the universe to put a period at the end of that sentence that wasn't the one he expected. I had no idea I was about to get it. This is where I have to slow down and tell you about the 2 weeks between the funeral and the reading, because those 2 weeks are the part of the story where I lost, where by every visible sign, Gordon won, and I went home with nothing. And if you'd looked in on us then, you'd have bet on him, and you'd have been right to. Because Gordon didn't wait for the reading. Of course he didn't. He had a key to Walter's house, Margaret's key, technically, given to her for emergencies during the sick winter, and he started going over. To secure the property, he told Margaret. To secure the property. I found out because Mrs. Pruitt called me, the second honest phone call in this whole story, and said, "His car's at your grandfather's. It's been there an hour. I thought you'd want to know." And by the time I drove over, Gordon was in the front room, and there were already 2 boxes by the door. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't even have the grace to look caught. He stood up from Walter's reading chair, from Walter's chair, and he said, "Just getting organized. No point letting good things sit and gather dust. There's some real value in here, Clara." The man had taste. He gestured at the room like an auctioneer, the clock, the good chairs. He'd already, I saw, put Walter's watch in his own pocket. I could see the chain. And then I looked at the little table by the chair, and the green book was gone. I asked him where the notebook was, the green one by the chair. He looked at me with a flat, pleasant blankness and said, "What notebook? There's no notebook. It's just papers, Clara. Junk. I'm sorting it." And he turned back to his boxes, and the conversation was over. And I stood in my dead grandfather's looted front room and understood that the green book, the record, the years of small noticed things, was already gone. Burned, probably, or in a dumpster 2 towns over. Gordon was a salesman. He cleaned up his accounts. That was the moment I felt it most, the losing. I drove home, and I sat in the dark, and I thought, he's going to get all of it. He's going to take the chairs and the clock and the watch, and whatever the will says, he's going to find a way around it. Because men like Gordon always find a way around it. And the people who said nothing for 30 years don't suddenly grow a voice at the end. The green book was gone. The one piece of proof that Walter had ever seen any of it. Gone. And without it, it was just my word, and my word had never counted for much in that family. I was the adopted one. Family in the ways that count, which is to say, not. For 2 weeks I believed I'd lost. I want you to sit in that with me, because I sat in it. I didn't sleep well. I let Gordon's phrase run in my head on a loop. Manage your expectations. And I managed them right down to 0, because that felt safer than hoping. I'd learned a long time ago that hope was a resource the adopted one couldn't afford. Margaret called me somewhere in those 2 weeks, and her voice was small, and she said, "Gordon says it'll all get worked out fairly. He says he's protecting the family's interests." And then, after a silence, in a voice I almost didn't hear, "Clara, do you think Dad knew about Gordon, about everything?" And I didn't know what to say, so I said the cowardly true thing, which was, "I don't know, Mom." And she said, No, of course not." He thought the world of Gordon at the end, and I let her have it. I let her have the railing. I didn't know that on the other side of town, in a locked office, in a folder with my grandfather's careful signature on it, the period was already written at the end of the sentence. Howard Greer's office was on the 2nd floor of an old brick building downtown, above a bakery, so the whole stairwell smelled like bread. which is a strange thing to remember about the most important morning of your life. But I remember it. Bread. I climbed the stairs in my funeral dress because it was the only thing dark enough I owned, and I remember thinking the smell of bread didn't belong on a day like this. The reading was at 10. I got there at 9:50. Gordon and Margaret were already there. Gordon in his good suit, expansive, comfortable, already treating Howard's waiting room like a place he owned. He'd brought his brother Wesley, which I found strange, and his lawyer, which I found stranger, a thin, nervous man with a briefcase, who I gathered was there in case anything needed to be contested. Contested. Gordon had come to a will reading with his own attorney. That tells you everything about how sure he was. He was so sure. That's what I remember most. He was relaxed. He clapped Wesley on the shoulder. He got Margaret a cup of water from the cooler and pressed it into her hands and said, "Almost done, hun. Almost through it." Like the will was a dental procedure. When he saw me come in, he gave me a look of such gentle, performed sympathy that I nearly admired it. "Clara," he said warmly, and he came over and he put a hand on my arm, and he lowered his voice, and he said the thing he'd been wanting to say for 2 weeks, the thing he dressed up as kindness. "I'm glad you came. I know it might be hard, hearing it official, but whatever it says, you know you'll always have a place with us. Your family in the ways that count. We took you in once." He squeezed my arm, this man. He squeezed my arm. "We'd never turn our backs on you now. We took you in once at the reading of my grandfather's will." He couldn't help himself. The fortress of kindness, with the knife inside it, one last time. I said, "Thank you, Gordon." And I went and sat down, because I still thought he was right. I still thought I'd come to watch them divide my grandfather, and that my only job was to get through it without crying in front of the man who'd taken the watch. Howard Greer came out at exactly 10. He was older than I'd realized. He and Walter had been the same age, two careful men of the same generation, and he had a folder under his arm, and he shook each of our hands, and when he got to mine, he held it a half-second longer than the others, and looked at me, and I didn't understand why. I do now. He knew what was in it. He was, I think, steadying himself, the way Walter steadied things with a flat hand on the table. He brought us into his office, and we sat, and he put on his glasses, and he opened the folder, and he said, "I drafted this with Walter 4 months ago." He was entirely lucid. We had 2 witnesses and a physician's note because Walter anticipated, and here Howard looked, very briefly, over the top of his glasses, not at me, at Gordon, that the document might be questioned. So I'll tell you now that it is airtight, and any contest would be both expensive and unsuccessful. I say that not as a threat. I say it because Walter asked me to say it, in those words, at the beginning, to save everyone some trouble. The room got very still. Gordon's lawyer shifted in his chair. Gordon himself still wore the comfortable face, but something had moved behind it. 4 months ago, the math was starting. 4 months ago was the depth of the sick winter. 4 months ago was the fruit baskets and the soft voice, and "We've got you, Walter." Gordon had thought he was performing for a man too far gone to revise anything. And here was Howard Greer, saying entirely lucid, 2 witnesses, a physician's note, watch this. Walter had caught the failure early, when there was still time to design around it. Howard began to read. There were small bequests first. To Yvonne, the home health aide, a sum that made me put my hand to my mouth. He'd seen her, he'd known what she was, and a line that said in Walter's voice through Howard's mouth, "For sitting with me when sitting was the only kindness left." To Mrs. Pruitt, the neighbor, the contents of his wine cellar and 40 years of soup repaid badly, with the only currency I have left. I almost laughed and cried at once. He'd seen everyone. He'd kept what he noticed. The green book was gone, but the man who'd written it had transcribed it in his way into this. And then Howard turned a page, and the room held its breath, and he came to the estate. The house, the investments. the proceeds from the sale of Hale Tool and Instrument decades ago, grown quietly in careful hands the whole time. Howard said the number out loud, a number just over $5 million. And I heard Wesley exhale, and I heard Gordon shift forward in his chair. That salesman's lean, the lean of a man about to close. And Howard Greer looked up from the folder, and for the first time he looked directly at me and held it. And then he looked back down, and he read, "The entirety of the remaining estate, in full and without condition, I leave to my granddaughter, Clara Hale." He said my name. He said my name, and the room did not erupt, because this is real life and not a film, and real rooms don't erupt. What happened was much quieter and much worse for Gordon than any eruption. What happened was a silence. I heard it before I understood it. I heard my own name in a dead man's will, Clara Hale, in full and without condition. And my first feeling was not triumph. I want to be exact, because I've had a long time to be exact. My first feeling was a sound in my own head, like a held note finally resolving, like the chord you've been waiting for the whole piece. He put a period at the end of the sentence. Clara Hale. Not the adopted one, not Margaret's sister's girl, not we took her in. My name, the one I changed back to at 18, the one he'd said was always mine. And then the silence in the room got a texture, and I came back into it, and I looked over, and I watched Gordon Castle's face do something I had waited 30 years to see, and had stopped believing I ever would. It fell. Not dramatically. That's the thing. It fell the way a building falls when the charge is set right. Straight down, all at once, into its own footprint. The comfortable expression, the salesman's warmth, the fortress of kindness, it all just came down, and underneath it, for one unguarded second, was the actual man. And the actual man was small. That's what I hadn't expected. Under all that bigness, that laugh, that confidence, the real Gordon was a small, frightened, greedy man who had just watched $5 million walk past him to a child he'd spent 3 decades reminding she didn't belong. That's not, he started, and stopped. He looked at his lawyer. His lawyer was looking very intently at the carpet. He looked at Howard. That can't be right. She's not even. And here it came, the thing he'd been circling for 2 weeks, the thing he finally said out loud in a lawyer's office, with his dead father-in-law's name still hanging in the air. She wasn't his daughter. Margaret was his daughter. Margaret, sitting right here, his actual child. He was pointing at Margaret now, at his own wife, using her like a document. And Clara was what? An orphan. Rose's kid with nobody. And we took her in. We took her in, out of the goodness of our own pockets. If it weren't for us, that girl would have been raised by strangers, shuffled around some poor family out in the suburbs, scraping by on nothing. That is where she came from. That is what we saved her from. And now you're telling me he handed her everything, $5 million, to the one we did charity on, over his own daughter? That's not a sound mind. That's manipulation. She spent that whole winter in that house, playing her little piano, getting in his ear. She got in his ear. Me, who played the piano he couldn't hear. I almost said it, because Howard Greer set down the folder and took off his glasses and looked at Gordon Castle for a long, level moment. And then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a second envelope, a smaller one, sealed, with my name on the front in a small, square engineer's hand. And he said, Walter anticipated this too. He asked me to give Clara this letter only if it became necessary. He said, and I'm quoting him, if they take it gracefully, she never needs to see it. If Gordon stands up and says the word adopted, give it to her and let her decide who hears it. He held the envelope out across the desk, to me, and the whole room turned to me. And for the first time in 30 years, in that family, every face was waiting on what I would do. I want to tell you that I tore it open and read it aloud and brought the house down. That would be the film version. Gordon's lawyer would have a great moment. What actually happened is I held the envelope, and I looked at my name in my grandfather's handwriting, and I could not, for a moment, speak at all. And I looked up, and I looked at Margaret, my mother, not Gordon. I'd stopped being interested in Gordon the second his face fell. There was nothing left in him I needed. I looked at Margaret, who was sitting very still with her cup of water in both hands, and who was staring at me with an expression I had never once seen on her face in 30 years. She wasn't upset that the money had gone to me. That's what stopped my breath. Her husband had just been disinherited in front of her. The family fortune had just walked past her, past Walter's own daughter, and into the hands of the girl she'd raised. And Margaret Castle was not upset. She was looking at me the way people look when something they'd given up on turns out to have been true the whole time. She was looking at me, I realized. The way you look when you're being rescued and you didn't know you'd been calling for help. Because she understood it, before I did even. She understood what her father had done. He hadn't left it to Margaret, his own daughter, because he knew exactly what would happen to $5 million in Margaret's hands. It would become Gordon's. Within a year, it would be a boat and a bad investment and a younger woman in a better apartment. And Margaret would be exactly where she'd always been, only poorer in the one thing she still secretly had, which was the option to leave. Walter knew that. He'd written it in a green book for years. So he didn't leave his daughter money. He left his daughter a door, and he put the key in the hand of the one person in the family who had never, not once, wanted anything from any of them. The granddaughter who only ever wanted the bench and the Bach and the open piano. He didn't leave me $5 million. He left me his daughter's freedom and trusted me to spend it right. So I did not read the letter aloud. I looked at Gordon, who was still half standing, still sputtering about sound minds and manipulation. And I did the thing my grandfather taught me, which was the thing the whole family had always mistaken for weakness. I said nothing. I put the letter in my bag, unopened, in front of all of them. And I stood up, and I smoothed my funeral dress, and I said to Howard, "Thank you. I'd like to schedule a separate appointment, please. There are some things I'm going to need help arranging." And to Gordon, who was staring at me now with naked hatred, the fortress gone for good, I said only, and I kept my voice exactly as level as Walter kept the warming pot. "He heard you on the phone in the hall, Gordon, the whole winter. He heard every word." And I walked out, down the stairwell that smelled like bread, into the ordinary afternoon. I read the letter that night, alone at my own piano. I'm not going to give you all of it. Some of it is mine. But I'll give you the part that matters, because it's the part that tells you who my grandfather actually was, underneath the T and the Bach and the small square hand. He wrote, "Clara, if you're reading this, then Gordon did the thing I expected, and you'll understand by now why I couldn't leave it to your mother directly. I'm sorry to make you the instrument of it. It isn't fair to hand you a job along with a gift. But you're the only one I trust, and you're the only one who never asked me for anything, which is exactly why you're the one who should hold it. Take care of her. Your mother was the best of my children, and she married a man who spent 30 years convincing her she was the worst. And I watched it happen, and I could never find the door to reach her through. You're the door. Give her enough that she never has to wonder whether she can afford to leave. Money can't buy much that's worth having. But it can buy a woman a locked apartment and a quiet morning and the right to close her own door against a man who was never sorry. Buy her that. And then, Clara, open the piano. Don't let it sit closed the way I did at the end. That was my one mistake of these last months. I should have kept it open, even when I couldn't play. A closed piano is a lie about the future. Keep yours open. Everything starts from C. When you get lost, come back to C. You were never lost to me, not for one day. You were the thing I was most sure of in a life I spent being sure of things. Your grandfather who chose you the same way you choose any home worth having, on purpose and for good. W. I gave the money to my mother, most of it, quietly, through Howard, structured so that it was hers and only hers, in her name, beyond any reach. It took a few weeks to arrange. I never told her the exact wording of the letter. I told her that her father had wanted her taken care of, and that this was how, and that there were no conditions and never would be, and that the only thing she had to do to keep it was nothing. She didn't have to earn it, didn't have to be fine, didn't have to not be a problem. It was just hers. I watched my mother understand, slowly, over the course of one long afternoon at my kitchen table, that she had options. I watched a woman who'd been disappearing for 20 years come a little way back into focus. It was not fast. Freedom isn't fast. That's the thing the films get wrong. It came on the way Walter said depth comes on, slow and complete. She asked Gordon to leave 6 weeks later. I wasn't there. She did it herself, which was the only way it could matter. I know it happened on a Tuesday because she called me afterward, and her voice was shaking, but it was her voice, the actual one, the one from before, the one I hadn't heard since I was small. She said, I asked him to go. I told him the house was being put in my name, and he wasn't on it, and he needed to find somewhere else to be. And then she said, Clara, he cried. He stood in the kitchen and he cried, and he said he didn't know what he'd done to deserve this. And there was a silence. And then my mother said something I will keep forever, in my small square hand, so I never have to argue with myself about what was true. And I realized I'd spent 30 years waiting for him to know what he'd done. And he was never going to know. So there was no reason to wait anymore. The divorce was final this past autumn. I don't know where Gordon is now. I could find out. Wesley would know. The family grapevine would know. But I haven't asked, and I've noticed I don't want to, and I've decided to trust that not wanting. He took the watch. He kept the watch. That was the one thing nobody could prove, and I let him have it. Let him keep one stolen thing. Let it tick on his wrist and remind him, if he's the kind of man who can be reminded, which he isn't. The last I saw him was the back of his good dark suit going down a stairwell that smelled like bread. And as endings go, I find I can live with that one. Some accounts you don't need to close, you just stop adding to them. My mother is well. She has a small apartment with good light, and she's taken up her own piano again. She played as a girl, before Gordon, before all of it, and she'd forgotten she knew how. She calls me sometimes in the evening and plays me something over the phone, badly, laughing at her own mistakes, and I sit at my end and listen, and I think about a green book, and a warming pot, and a man who designed a door for his daughter out of the only material he had left. I kept very little of the money for myself, a new piano for the school, in his name. The rest is hers. I have what I always wanted, which was never the 5 million. I have the bench, and the Bach, and the letter in a drawer, and his name, which is my name, Hale, which was always mine. This evening, like most evenings, I warmed the pot before I made the tea. I don't know when I started doing that. Sometime in the last year, without deciding to. You drop something fragile, and you want it to land somewhere ready. Then I sat down at the piano, and I checked, the way I always check now, that the lid was open. It was open. It stays open. I found C, and I began.